drinks somewhere.
Well, Allison, thank you. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for being here. Just wanted to start off by very simply asking you, what are the FTC's endorsement guides? What do they say in layman's terms, and who do they affect?
Okay. So the FTC endorsement guides are really the FTC's guidance with respect to ensuring that endorsements are truthful and non-misleading. And there's 3 simple principles. The first principle is that endorsements have to be honest. Secondly, endorsers must have support for any claims that they make. And 3, that endorsers need to disclose their material connections with the sponsoring advertiser. Now, what's a material connection? It could be payments, free products, free trips, lender products, or even an employment relationship that the consumer would not necessarily understand or recognize.
Okay. So what has like the FTC done heretofore that would govern influencer marketing prior to what they released in earlier this month?
Well, the FTC has really been known for going after marketers for violations of FTC endorsement guides, and I think that's why it is such a. Oh, how does this work?
Let me help you.
And that's why I think
maybe I should do this.
Yeah. That's why I think when we look at the Martin and Cassell action, it was so important. But before that, the FTC was really going after marketers in general for violations of the FTC endorsement guides, whether it was their influencers not disclosing or the influencer networks not telling their influencers to disclose. And there have been some major FTC enforcement actions coming out of that. Now, you had asked me, what happens, what are the penalties for an FTC action? And it really can be an investigation, a warning letter, or an enforcement action. And the enforcement action is really like the FTC's version of its own type of lawsuit. And almost all the time, the enforcement actions end up settling. And the problem with these settlements is that they are a 20-year order. And they have significant and comprehensive monitoring, disclosure, and reporting obligations on the party that's settling. So if you're a major marketer and you want to run a huge influencer campaign, if you're subject to a 20-year order with extensive monitoring, reporting, and disclosure obligations, it's going to make it very hard to do that. Now, I also say that everybody says, are there fines for FTC violations of the endorsement guides? And under the FTC's authority, they can't bring fines, but they can make a company provide consumer reimbursement, and they can also make a company disgorge profits. But really, at the end of the day, I think it's a 20-year order that you really want to stay away from. But I also say, I think the worst part of an FTC action is the fact that it brings such negative publicity onto the marketer that's subject to the action. Now, these FTC actions get tons of publicity, and it's all negative, and it has really bad headlines. Let's take last year. Both Warner Brothers and Lord & Taylor were subject to an FTC action. Those are both reputable, honest companies. But the headlines that came down said, Lord & Taylor deceived consumers with deceptive advertising. Now, if you're a marketer in this room, that's the last type of headline you would ever want. So in addition to staying away from, an FTC enforcement action, you also want to stay away from the bad publicity. And that's why it's important to adhere to the FTC endorsement guides.
Do I change this?
Oh, no, you could keep it up here.
Keep it. What specific? So we heard about the Warner Brothers thing a little bit earlier, but so they're subject now to 20 years of monitoring by the FTC.
Well, they're subject to a 20-year order.
Is it just of their social activity, or I'm sorry, their influencer?
Just influencer activity.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
And it's a 20-year order, so they have to comply with the FTC endorsement guides for at least 20 years.
Okay.
Some of the monitoring reporting obligations might be less. It might be 5 years. It might be 10 years. But at least they're under a 20-year order. And if they violate it, they can be subject to fines at the FTC level, possibly $40,000 each violation. So that's another way that the FTC has teeth.
Okay.
As for, I think, what we were going to get to today is, what's happened recently with respect to FTC endorsements. And as the last panel discussed, on September 7th, the FTC announced its first action against individual influencers. And what what that panel actually did address correctly is that's probably going to be the tip of the iceberg. That's not just, that's the first action against individual influencers, but it's probably not going to be the last. But there were also 2 other announcements the FTC made that day. One, or actually 2 up there, that it had sent 21 updated warning letters to influencers. Now, this is important because in April, the FTC actually sent 90 letters to influencer marketers that had not been disclosing their endorsements. Now, it had come to the FTC's attention that at least 21 of those influencers was still not disclosing their endorsements, so they received a second letter. The FTC also updated its FTC endorsement guides. So what it was doing there is trying to give the industry more information on how to make disclosures, trying to educate influencers on how to make disclosures on social media. So, this announcement is very important on September 7th because by announcing 3 major influencer issues in the same press release on the same day, the FTC is really saying that influencer marketing is a top priority. I know the panel before me doesn't think that it is a top priority and doesn't think the FTC should be spending their time focusing on influencer marketing, but whether they like it or not, the sad thing is the FTC is, for whatever reason, focused on influencer marketing. And by making this announcement, it's also clear that the FTC is going to use all the tools in its arsenal to combat what it believes is deceptive influencer marketing, whether it's enforcement actions, warning letters, or education through the endorsement guides. We can go to the next slide.
Okay.
So they stole my thunder the last panel, but it was a really important announcement the other day when the FTC announced that it had brought its first action against social media influencers. And it was against Martin and Casale, who probably, unless you're in the influencer gaming industry, you don't know them. So you're probably wondering why this is such an important action. And I think to understand why it's such an important action, you really have to look at the history of the FTC endorsement guides and influencer marketing. So in 2009, when the FTC updated its endorsement guides to make clear that it applied to bloggers and social media, the FTC said, we don't want to go after bloggers. We don't want to hold bloggers responsible. We really want to hold the marketer responsible. The marketer is the one who's the sophisticated entity. They're the one making all the money off the bloggers' endorsements, and they should really be responsible for training and ensuring that their bloggers make the appropriate disclosures. But that was a time when the blogger was the mommy blogger, probably making a couple $1,000s a year off her posts. Since that time, the influencer marketing has gone into a multi-million-dollar industry with certain influencers becoming celebrities in their own right and certain influencers making tens of millions of dollars off their social media posts. So it's not surprising last summer when the FTC announced its action against Warner Brothers that the FTC named in its press release PewDiePie. I think we all know PewDiePie for good or bad reasons. He's pretty notorious now. But at the time, he was making about $12 million off his social media posts and endorsements. And he was specifically named in the FTC's press release. And what I believe the FTC was doing there was saying, you know what, if you're an influencer who makes this amount of money off your post and you become a celebrity in your own right, you are on notice that you could be subject to your own FTC action. And then a couple of months later, when the FTC sent the 90 warning letters to influencers and marketers who allegedly were not disclosing on Instagram their relationships, the FTC said in those letters that, if you don't disclose, you will be subject to an FTC action. So once again, giving influencers notice that they could be subject to an FTC action. Now, why this action is important? Because the notice period is over. The FTC is now going to go after influencers who do not disclose their relationships with brands and with sponsors in their social media posts. Notice is over, and it's going to go after particularly those who are repeated violators of the FTC endorsement guides. If we could go to the next.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So do you think that, well, obviously this targets the influencers themselves as sort of media companies, I guess, but well, who stands to, I think you said it earlier, that brands stand to lose a lot based on the PR and, the bad publicity and things like that. But who would you say stands to lose the most with all of this?
Anybody who's subject to the action.
Which could be the brands and the influencers.
Yeah, and with the 21 influencer letters that went out a couple weeks ago, it's notable that these letters actually said that if they don't respond by September 30th, the FTC is going to take further action. Mm-hmm. So you have 21 influencers there who have to respond by September 30th. And if they don't, it's very likely one of them is going to be subject to an FTC action. And unlike Martin and Cascell, who, unless you're in the video game industry, you don't know them, these letters went to a lot of well-known celebrities. Like this one went to Sofia Vergara, another one went to Naomi Campbell, Vanessa Hudson received one, and then if you are fans of the Jersey Shore, JWoww and Snooki also received letters. So you can imagine, the publicity that's going to come out if these celebrities are subject to their own FTC action. So who stands to lose? Yes, Sofia Vergara or Snooki or JWoww, if they get subject to an action, because it's going to get a lot of headlines.
Right.
Lord & Taylor's had a lot of headlines, but you have an action against Sofia Vergara by the FTC, she's going to have a lot of headlines, and it's going to be bad publicity for her. It's going to be headlines that say Sofia Vergara deceives her consumers. Sofia Vergara is a deceptive influencer. And if you want to see, her post, it's in the next slide. And you're probably wondering, oh, what did she do? That was so bad. But this is what the FTC is concerned about. She's post there. She tags Dolce & Gabbana. She has a Dolce & Gabbana iPhone cover there. And the FTC is concerned because there's no disclosure. The assumption is she is a Dolce & Gabbana spokesperson, but did not disclose that relationship. And I actually like this post because I looked up that Dolce & Gabbana iPhone cover. It costs $495.
Oh, wow.
So if you're a consumer, you're seeing that, and you want to get that same Dolce & Gabbana iPhone cover, you could see why the FTC is a little concerned that there was no disclosure of an advertisement. So if you want to go to the next slide. Okay. But she wasn't the only famous celebrity who was subject to an FTC action. Do you guys remember Lindsay Lohan?
Of course.
At one point, she was probably one of the most famous celebrities in the United States, whether rightly or wrongly. But one of her reputation was that she never apologized, never made amends. Well, she got a second letter. So do you think she is going to respond and say she is going to comply with the guides? And do you think in her next post, she is going to make the appropriate disclosures that the FTC wants her to make? Well, knowing it's Lindsay Lohan, the answer is probably no. And if she doesn't, she is likely going to be subject to an FTC action. So you can imagine the media hysteria that will, take place if Lindsay Lohan herself is subject to an FTC action. And you also have to think, you asked who stands to lose, but think about it. Who wants to hire, Sofia Vergara or Lindsay Lohan or one of these celebrities who has bad headlines saying that they deceive their consumers? I think they all have to be careful about their own brand if they get subject to an action and it starts to make headlines.
Right, but I think we need to be clear though that this is not enforceable in terms of like anyone going to jail. It's just fines, right?
It's not even fines. It's really fines. Just it's going to be an order. They're going to have to ensure they comply. Okay. There's some issues. They might have to give up their profits. They might have to give consumer restitution.
Okay. Got it.
Can we ask a question?
Sure.
Isn't that just awesome for her? I'm sorry, but I don't think.
For who?
I think Lindsay Lohan's fans just won't care. This is great publicity. There's no fine. It's free advertising. I think that some of these influencers just won't care.
That's an interesting point. I just work with a lot of brands and a lot of agencies that if somebody has that reputation or the stigma or an FTC action against them, they're not going to work with them. Because really what the FTC does, once you're on their radar, they're not going to give up. So if they went after Lindsay Lohan, if you want to show the next slide, there she tags SSH Maritime. It's a yacht industry, which if she was paid, she didn't disclose it. So let's say she gets in trouble for that post. But if another brand hires her, it's very clear that the FTC is going to be watching that brand and Lindsay Lohan's post. And that brand is not going to want to be brought into an action because they know that because they know the FTC is watching Lindsay Lohan specifically. But you're right. She probably personally would like that publicity. I think it's going to hurt her when it comes to finances and people hiring her at least reputable companies hiring her to promote their brand.
So he brings up a good point, though. It's like if we can't trust the celebrities to sort of monitor this themselves, I guess it's beholden on the brands and maybe the agencies to make sure that they're on board with the endorsement guides, right? Meaning the influencers.
Yeah, the FTC has always says the marketer, the brands are ultimately responsible for everyone in their chain who's making a disclosure. Okay. For everyone in the chain who's responsible for influencer marketing, whether it's the advertising agency, the influencer network, or the influencer. The marketer is always responsible. Okay. But as influencers become celebrities in their own right, the FTC is going to start holding these influencers, who are celebrities in their own right, responsible for ensuring that they also comply. So while the marketer is always responsible, the FTC is now saying that influencers themselves, particularly if you make $1 million or you make a lot of money off your endorsements, you are also going to have to comply.
Got it. Okay, next slide, or?
Yeah, we could go.
Okay.
So the third announcement on September 7th was the FTC had updated its endorsement guides. And this is really interesting because not only is the FTC bringing actions, but it's also trying to educate the industry on how to make disclosures. So if people are interested in how to make disclosures, we can go through some.
I don't think any of us are influencers here.
Okay.
So I think we're good. Okay. Next one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, these are mostly the FTC endorsement guides. So.
So I go through this. Okay. Well, all right. So is there a role for the platforms here? I just wanted to get that, like, meaning the Facebook, Instagram, etc. Like, do they have to work with the FTC on this, or are they kind of removed from it, being like, this is just my platform and this just
Why don't we go to the
my
last two slides, because I think they're going to be helpful.
You're gonna okay. Not this one.
Okay. So when the FTC.
Oh, go back.
No, it's the last two.
Last two. Oh, I don't know how many there are.
I'm a lawyer. I have a lot of slides.
14?
Yeah, that one. Okay.
Oh, all right, back.
So I don't know if you know, over the summer, Instagram launched its branded content disclosure tool. It supposedly allows brands to have their influencers disclose their relationship in the language and in the mechanism that Instagram gives them. But interesting, in the FTC's latest endorsement guides update, there was this FAQ where social media platforms I use has a built-in feature that allows me to disclose paid endorsements. Is it sufficient for me to rely on that tool? And the FTC said not necessarily. Just because a platform offers a feature like that is no guarantee it's an effective way for influencers to disclose their material connection to a brand. Now, if you really read the whole FAQ, it was pretty clear they were calling out the Instagram branded content tool and YouTube's branded content tool, saying they were not sufficient. So I actually called the FTC. I said, are what you're trying to say there saying that the Instagram branded content tool is not sufficient in making disclosures? And the FTC said, yes, personally, we don't think it is sufficient. So to the extent there was any doubt and whether there was any, ambiguity, whether or not the FTC believes the Instagram tool is not effective, during a Twitter chat on September 20th, the FTC advised that it does not believe the Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube built-in disclosure tools are sufficient. So to the extent you have been using them or you're asking your influencers to use them, you just have to be aware that the FTC does not believe they comply with the FTC endorsement guides. So if you want to go to the next slide, to see, this is the Instagram branded content tool. What the FTC would advise is that in addition to using that, if you're going to continue to use that, you should use one of the FTC approved methods of disclosure, whether it's #ad or #sponsored. So to the extent, if Instagram wants people to be using these tools, they may need to have to work with the FTC to make sure it complies with, the FTC's guidance, because according to the FTC, this doesn't comply. Instagram and Facebook and YouTube can do it on their own, but they probably don't want to get a third shot at it. You might as well just work with the FTC, and they can tell you what they believe is not sufficient with these branded content tools.
Okay. Do we have an example of what is sufficient?
From a branded content tool?
Yeah, like.
No, because the FTC said the three major ones aren't.
Okay.
But if you are looking for, if you are looking for what is sufficient, the FTC is saying, if it's Twitter posts, you have #ad, you have #sponsored, you have #paid ad. In Instagram, if you include a disclosure like that in the first, 3 lines of the post, not below the click more, that would be sufficient. And one other important point is that the FTC, there's an incorrect assumption out there that the FTC has mandated language, that you can only use sponsored and you can only use ad. And that's not exactly true. The FTC is saying you can, as long as you can make a disclosure that's clear and conspicuous in language that's understandable, that describes the relationship, that would be sufficient. So you're not going to be pigeonholed in using, sponsored ad or paid ad. As long as you can describe the language, even in organic language, it will be sufficient. So you're not always required to use those hashtags.
Okay. Awesome. So last question for me is sort of what comes next? Like, what about the future here? How often can the FTC issue updates to this? I don't know. How can the influencer marketing community expect to hear from them again? That kind of thing.
Well, the FTC can always update its FAQs. I mean, that's really just helping the industry. But it usually comes around every 2 years or in connection with a major development. What do I think is next? I think those 21 warning letters went out to influencers. They have till September 30th to respond and to start complying with the FTC endorsement guides. I think it's very likely that not all of them are going to start complying. Right. So I think we're going to see some FTC actions against influencers, who are real celebrities with well-known names, and that's going to get a lot of publicity. I don't know if it's going to be the Lindsay Lohan or the Naomi Campbell or the Sofia Vergara or the Snooki, but it's very likely that there is going to be action against one of these people because they've been put on notice twice now. And if you ignore the FTC the third time, you're likely going to be subject to an action. And I also wanted to say, it's just not the FTC bringing these actions out here. Just be aware that there's a lot of advocacy groups, whether it's Truth in Advertising or Public Citizen, who are constantly monitoring influencer activity and then reporting it in very high-profile complaints to the FTC. And these high-profile complaints are picked up in the media as well. So even if you escape, some type of regulatory complaint, just be aware that if your influencers are, not complying with the guides, they are being watched by these advocacy groups who are publishing these very high-profile reports, sending them to the FTC that are getting a lot of media scrutiny. And I think that's where a lot of the pressure on the FTC is to act on influencers. That last panel said, I don't think this is a high priority. Well, the FTC is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because you have advocacy groups telling them that they're not doing a good enough job and they need to be pursuing influencer marketing, much more harshly and more aggressively, and getting a lot of media attention to that. So we're going to see, probably some influencer action coming out of those 21 letters, and we're also going to see, more advocacy groups filing complaints, getting media publicity, and just following influencers in general.
Okay. All right, Allison, thank you so much. Do we have questions? Is that a question over there? Okay, wait. I got to bring in the mic. It's for the folks at home. There you go.
Hi, I'm Scotty Reese. I have a digital content site called She Buys Cars. And we do a lot of influencer marketing. And when we do a marketing program, of course, we disclose everything. But on the content side, we disclose every time we are loaned a car, taken on a trip, that kind of thing. But we're pretty much the only ones that do. And not too long ago, the fashion industry was kind of set on fire by not disclosing things that were given, trips, products, things like that. Where do you see that going, and where does that role? Is there a gray area for journalists who are being paid or being sent on trips and all their expenses are taken care of to create content that is not disclosed to the reader?
Okay. Well, some of the slides I had talked about the FTC FAQs that talked about bloggers and online influencers who were being sent to fashion shows or sent to resorts or sent away to talk about or just to, on a trip to experience something in connection with a company's product, and the FTC said that needed to be disclosed. You need to say, the trip was provided by XYZ, trip sponsored by XYZ. But one thing I think is interesting is that I believe the FTC takes a different position when it comes to online blogs and influencers than it does traditional media. And I think it goes back to the fact that, traditional media, the New York Times, Condé Nast, has been sending fashion editors to fashion events for decades. And there's been no disclosure. And there's a thinking with the FTC that when it comes to traditional media, that they have editorial guidelines, they have their own editorial board, that consumers may actually know that they're flying editors to these fashion shows because it's been done for years. I believe they take obviously based on the FAQs, the FTC takes a different position with online magazines, influencer magazine, blogs. There is an assumption that they don't have the same editorial standards, even though if you see some of these fashion blogs, they are becoming, almost as powerful as, probably Condé Nast or some type of magazine or Vogue to some degree. But the FTC takes a position that they are subject to, I think, different guidelines where a disclosure would be necessary, that if you are editor of an online publication, you need to disclose when you're flown to a fashion show or you're flown to an event by the sponsor of that. Do I think it's fair? Probably not, but I think the FTC is very rooted in traditional media versus new media.
Does it have to do with lobbying dollars? Just kidding.
No, I just want to. You know what? I don't think it is. I think it really has to do with they're more comfortable with traditional media. I think a lot of people who work at the FTC are a lot older. They're not as comfortable with social media platforms. They're not even comfortable with things like abbreviations. We all know what hashtag sponsored means. For years, the most, the most used hashtag was always hashtag spawn. The FTC said, oh, people don't understand what that means. How many people in this room know what hashtag spawn means? Sponsored, yes, everybody. And probably everybody you know knows it. But the FTC takes a very old school look at things and said, oh, they take it from their viewpoint, maybe not the traditional Twitter audience, whether they would know what hashtag spawn means. So you're dealing with, I think, a lot of people who come from traditional media background. They brought their cases under traditional media backgrounds. They're more comfortable in that background, and they're trying to catch up to social media and influencer marketing.
Okay. Another question in the back?
Question.
I'm coming. That's okay. Just tell us who you are and where you work, please.
My name's Blair Rayner. I work at Bacardi. I don't understand the law that much, so apologies. But in terms of, this is an American law that I'm assuming if you're an American, you have to put it's sponsored and so forth. How do you deal with sort of a Keira Knightley doing a Dior? She's got massive reach in the US. It's like one rule for one rule for another in that kind of sponsorship, because she doesn't have to put it's an ad sponsored.
So do you mean if Keira Knightley appears in a television commercial?
No, she does a post and she's a British citizen, so we don't have these laws, but she's got reach in the US.
Yeah. It's funny because one of the new FAQs talks right about that subject matter and says, you know what, if you're an influencer and you reasonably believe that your post is going to reach people in the United States, you need to have a disclosure that complies with the U.S. law. But also, UK has its own laws. It's a little different than the U.S., and it's probably not as rigorously enforced. But if it is intended to be like a YouTube video or a Twitter post that is reasonably going to be coming into the United States and attracting viewers in the United States, it is supposed to have a compliant, U.S. compliant disclosure. But also the UK does have its own laws, and they're similar, but maybe not as rigorously enforced. Any other questions? You get free legal advice.
There you go.
And then drinks afterwards.
I think, anyone else? No? All right. Well, Allison, thank you very much for that.
Thanks.